Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, and consultant, and I'll be your host. The topic of my conversation today with energy advocate Deidra Garyk is the International Sustainability Standards Board and the newly released Sustainability and Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Standards that Canada is determined to implement. Before we get into the conversation, I'd like to just take a few minutes to set up the background and context for our audience. I'd also like to apologize in advance for the number of acronyms that we'll be using in this conversation. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable. When trying to understand who's responsible for these standards, it's like peeling back an onion. There's layers upon layers of organizations involved. So to begin with, out of the COP26 climate meetings back in Glasgow in 2021, the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was established within the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, or IFRS. And its goal was to create a new global baseline for sustainability and climate-related financial disclosures. Or you could also think of it as a sort of global ESG standard reporting. Now, the ISSB is promoted by the G7 and the G20 and has offices in Montreal, Frankfurt, and now Beijing. Normally, this type of standard setting takes several years to be reviewed and refined, but within 4 months of existing, the first two standards of the ISSB were released for comment. The comments were then deliberated for 7 months, revised and finalized, and were released a few weeks ago on June 26, 2023. Now, these are the first two of a planned set of at least 5 building blocks that will be interoperable with jurisdictions around the world. Now, this proposed mandatory global baseline, meaning which is often referred to as a new global language, will be linked to financial statements. Previously, if a company had a sustainability report or an environmental social governance or ESG report, they wouldn't be held liable for the information within it. It would be a statement, a forward-looking projection of where they would like to go or what they're accomplishing. But these will be linked to financial statements, meaning that businesses will be liable for any statements made in these disclosures. If governments adopt these standards, then banks, insurers, and investors will eventually mandate this information from every company, and perhaps at some point in the very near future, every individual. Now, among many other things, the new global standards mandate the annual reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's 3 different scopes. There's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Which basically means all direct and indirect emissions that can be linked to a company up and down its entire value chain. From the making of a product to how it's transported, used, and disposed of after purchase. It also mandates the annual use of climate scenario analysis to assess ongoing and future climate risks and opportunities. Now, depending on the size of company and what its operations are, the estimates for complying with the cost of emissions accounting and climate risk scenario analysis are estimated to be around $400,000 a year. Now, of particular importance for Western Canada, there are requirements to disclose the gross percentage of operations that occur in areas of high or extreme high baseline water stress. The World Resources Institute Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas tool must be used, and pretty much all of southern Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, and southern Alberta are designated as high or extreme high water stress areas. There are other aspects of the standards that are problematic for the oil and gas industries, which perhaps we will get into during the conversation. Now, one last point. The information required of all businesses is intended for banks, insurers, and investors who will have to account for the amount of absolute emissions on their books. Canada lobbied for and received an ISSB office in Montreal, and has established a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to work in lockstep with the ISSB to implement the new standard. This board will consider the ISSB standards and apparently decide if they will be adopted fully or in part. The chair, Charles-Antoine Saint-Jean, told the Globe and Mail back in April that he intended to open stakeholder consultations once the ISSB standards were released. But it's unclear if these will be targeted consultations, meaning they pick and choose the companies they wish to talk with, or full and open meetings to the public about these types of standards that will transform Canada's economy. There has been no news yet, as of July 7th, on whether or not these consultations will be going forward. That all being said, Deidra Garyk is here with me today. She's an energy advocate and a contributor to Energy Now, and is going to discuss the issue. Welcome to the podcast, Deidra. Could you just take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate all of the work that you do on just energy analysis in general, as well as the work that you have been doing to bring to light these ESG or international sustainability standards. So I'm quite excited for our discussion today. I am, as you said, an independent energy advocate. I kind of fell into the space of almost 5 years ago now, sort of in the heart of the downturn that we had been going through here in Calgary, the energy capital of Canada, or I should probably say oil and gas capital of Canada. That's what we're known for. And I had watched a lot of people lose their job, a lot of really great people. And for me, it was really important that we started to tell the story of the people behind the business, behind the oil and gas products that we produce. And so I've had great opportunities to interact with a lot of various people, and I've learned a lot about energy, and I've continued to sort of advocate for and support the people who work in it. I myself have worked in the industry for almost 20 years now. I can't quite believe that. I have been on the production side in joint venture contracts. So I was responsible for gaining access to, your pipelines, your compressors, your plants to get that product processed and out to markets where it's a usable product that we all use every day. And now I am working in ESG for an oil field services company, and I've been doing that for almost 2 years now.
Excellent. So what do you make of these new international standards? How do you think this is going to, what do you think of them, and how do you think this is going to affect your company?
Well, I think I'll start with a couple of disclaimers. So these are my views. They are not the views of my company. And the other thing that I think that's important to understand is I'm neither disciple nor detractor of ESG. I'm trying to be very pragmatic about this. ESG disclosure, it's happening. It's not going away. There is an energy disruption happening now. Consumer preferences are changing. Consumers want lower or low carbon energy sources. And so I think we have to be sort of honest and pragmatic about where things are going. And the other thing that I would like to say to people who support responsible energy or resource development and who maybe have some concerns with ESG, please do not abdicate this space. It's important that we stay aware of what is happening, work in these spaces to help shape where these standards end up going. I think that we cannot be naive and believe that in some way, us little Alberta-based oil and gas companies can fight ESG, because it's just not a realistic approach, I think. And so I think we have to find a way to work within it and use it to our benefit, highlight what it is that we are already doing. We have very, very stringent environmental standards in Canada for our oil and gas development. And so this is an opportunity for us to showcase what it is that we are doing. Now, that being said, I also think we have to be realistic about the challenges that companies are going to endure as they go through this, especially at the beginning. I mean, it's going to be essentially like enhancing your financial reports, right? You're just going to have to report even more in a very short amount of time. So in terms of what I think about the standards, I think that there are kind of pros and cons to it. I think it'll be nice to have some consistency and comparability. And I do think that, there is real validity to, environmental concerns such as access to water and, responsible use of it. I think that good governance is very important. You think about the crypto exchange FTX and the fact that they didn't have a board, but yet we're given billions of dollars. Investors can't really know what they're getting into if there isn't a level of transparency. And so I think, there is a value to disclosing information. There's a value to sort of risk management and risk preparation. However, there's definitely a bias that you see in the standards against oil and gas, or against fossil fuels, I should say. I mean, they're certainly no more favorable to coal than they are to oil and gas. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I have, is that they're sort of normalizing this idea of like, yeah, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels entirely. And so again, I think that's an opportunity for oil and gas companies to be transparent and honest about what they are reporting. Like, building trust in the information that's reported is really critical, because if we don't honestly report, we can't adequately assess our risks, and then we don't really implement the best policies or solutions. And I think climate change is a great example of sort of where we've got sort of muddled information, and the electorate is demanding that politicians implement more and more ridiculous policy in the name of climate change.
That's an interesting point there about this comparability and sense of transparency, because I think there's opportunities there to say, look, as an industry, this is how we're all being compared. One of the problems is with the ESG raters, which it does not fall under any of this at all. So I'll be curious to see, because right now they sort of say, well, all these different companies provide different information. Well, if you're going to have now this standard where everybody's reporting the same thing, then I think it'll be an interesting space for the ESG raters, because how can they possibly come up with all of these various scoring categories and whatnot, or differences, if they're all using the same information? But that's another issue. That's another issue altogether. But
yeah, well, certainly the rating agencies are a huge problem, and I think that's a pay for play space, and it's very expensive. Like, my company's been approached by a couple of different rating agencies, and they want roughly about $50,000 Canadian a year to, sort of help us with analysis, and they would help us understand our score, help us improve it. I mean, wow, it's just pay for play. It's not right. They should be, our rating should be we're rating based on who we are as a company and how we operate. So yeah, absolutely. Rating agencies, I think, are kind of a challenge there. But the other piece to this too, that does, I guess, cause me some confusion, is that they do talk about, well, yeah, you're all going to report the same information. And in some ways that's accurate, but I think in some ways that's not entirely true, because under the general sustainability standards, it's up to companies to explain what is material to their business. So what's material to an oil and gas company is not going to be material to, like, a tech company or even like an auto company. So again, there is definitely going to be some comparability, but yes, it is still going to be a little bit up to us to decide what it is that we're going to talk about. And you end up doing that through a materiality assessment, which typically has a cost. You end up paying a third party so that you get objective, unbiased information about what is important to your stakeholders, thereby what is important to your company. So I think the theme that people will hear is dollars, dollars, dollars.
Yeah, I'm looking at the estimates that the Securities Exchange Commission of the United States put forward when they had their call for comment on the climate-related disclosures they wanted to do, and the cost estimates for compliance, whether it be with the scenario analysis or the GHG emissions accounting, because of course in these standards, it's not just that you have to account for all of these emissions along the entire value chain. You also have to get it third party verified. And I think it's not just the accounting that's going to be so expensive, but the verification of it, because in reading through the standard, every single element where you put any kind of quantitative data has to be third-party verified. And my understanding is that the International Accounting Standards Board has only recently released, I think last week, a document to help auditors do this kind of thing, but it's only open for comment. So they haven't even finalized how they're going to audit this, and yet they want the ISSB said this should be implemented for fiscal year 2024 when the auditing measures aren't even in place yet.
Yeah, and I actually think that that's going to be an interesting piece to all of this, because in talking with one of the big four, they have said that they just simply don't have enough people to even sort of be able to provide the guidance and then to be able to audit it. And I think that's something that's a little bit unclear to me right now. Like as I read through the ISSB standards, or IFRS standards, I should say, there is sort of this appearance of reasonableness. Like they do consistently say, like, gather this data without undue cost or effort. But it's a bit unclear to me, like, how are the auditors and the regulators going to approach that? I mean, if we have auditors that maybe are not extremely knowledgeable in what exactly these standards mean, or, even how you calculate a ton of CO2, I mean, how reasonable are they going to be? We just met yesterday to review our emissions for 2022, and it's very complicated. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to see there. And then I think that if you kind of look at what are some of the risks, well, data collection, especially for emissions, is going to be very difficult. And if you don't have good quality data, or you're unintentionally missing a piece of information, or they don't like your emissions reduction targets, you can be subject to litigation. And the EMGOs have found a brand new sledgehammer to use, and they are going after oil and gas companies. We're seeing more and more of it. And the courts are sort of wringing their hands in glee at the prospect of getting to adjudicate this. They're no longer just throwing out these climate suits by, the Earth's climate litigant. What do they call themselves? Climate law, I believe. They seem to be really at the heart of a lot of these against these big multinationals. So, this is another reason why I just think that oil and gas companies and even the anti-ESG folks cannot bury their heads in the sands, because the ENGOs are finding another tool to go after development.
Right. And in Canada, they're not just doing litigation, they're using the Competition Bureau, and they're using the Advertising Bureau or whatever. So it's a death by 1,000 cuts, really, with respect to the different cases being brought forward. And one of the interesting elements I found in the IFRS standards put forward by the ISSB was that one of the risks that companies are supposed to take into account is the potential for litigation, liability for litigation. And I'm thinking, Well, how does one estimate that? I mean, you're doing everything you can to be a responsible and ethical operator, but some groups out there are going to litigate you no matter what you do. So that's going to be counted against you. So groups can put forward frivolous lawsuits, and that counts against a company's disclosure. That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What I think, there's a couple of big risks for Canadian oil and gas companies is our governments and our untenable legislation that are going to hamstring resource development. They're going to create investment risk and uncertainty. And I think tied into that is going to be the opportunity for anti-development groups to litigate, because they're going to say you're not following the regulations in a certain way, or the divestment movement. They're just going to find more and more ways to use this to their advantage. I think we're going to see more of these maybe like desirable progressive energy companies like wind and solar are going to get a free pass in a lot of ways. And then you're going to have your oil and gas and coal companies are just going to get hammered by, either unreasonably stringent regulations, unreasonable reporting requirements, or just the constant threat of litigation, which takes them away from focusing on their core business activities.
And shareholder return. So they can't make the investment money and decisions that shareholders are expecting. What I noticed in the industry guidelines, in the draft for comment and in the draft standards, those were going to be mandatory, but they are taking some time to figure out how they can make them more internationally applicable. So at the moment, they're just guidelines, but nothing really changed from what they had in the draft for what they put forward now. And I noticed that with the wind turbines, they don't have to account for the emissions in the concrete pad or the emissions of the steel tower. They only have to account for the emissions embedded in the nacelle, in the construction of and the value chains involved in building the nacelle and the blades, where if you calculate the emissions of a wind turbine, the majority of the emissions is in that concrete pad and in the steel tower, but they don't have to account for that. So to me, that was evidence to what you said earlier about there seems to be a sort of bias against the oil and gas industry and preference given to whatever's the trendy, acceptable, renewable energy systems that they're trying to promote.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that these standards had a real opportunity to be fair, to judge equally and fairly all industries, all companies across the board. And then that's where I do think that oil and gas has the opportunity to showcase how it is being a good corporate citizen. And we are already working within very stringently regulated environmental environments. However, I think you're right. They have found a way to, I guess you could almost say, pick winners and losers. I mean, that's not exactly an accurate statement, but you can see where they are trying to push investment, because like you had said, the audience for these standards and this information is now limited from sort of the general public. In the past for ESG was, anybody and everybody who might be interested in this, from your employees to the communities you operate in, et cetera, to now being very focused on investors, banks, insurance companies would likely be looking at this as well. And so I think what we're seeing is a desire to kind of shape where society goes. And so one of the things that stood out to me as I've been reading through some of the ISSB's commentary and press releases, et cetera, was Emmanuel Faber, the ISSB chair, said that the climate standards may be increased to include connection to natural ecosystems, deforestation, biodiversity, and just transition. So you can start to see that there's a real linking of climate to social justice or social inequality. And so the way that I've kind of looked at that is the ISSB is really looking for businesses to be the drivers of social change, to be the ones that are going to fix all the climate problems. And so, hey, we're going to give a bit of a pass to wind and solar because we believe that this is how it's going to solve the climate crisis, which, you know, one of the challenges I do have with the climate standard is that it's really built on the premise that climate change is an existential crisis, that we're going to enter some sort of planetary collapse cycle here rather imminently. And the only way that we're going to stop this is by decarbonization, which means we have to get rid of fossil fuels and we have to do it as fast as possible. I mean, throughout the climate standard, they use the word urgent. You know, the reason that the climate standard is the standard that they are forcing us to report on first and giving a 1 year reprieve on the general sustainability standards is because climate is so urgent and we have to resolve this now. So you can see that, I don't know if you want to call it social engineering, but there is a little bit of that you can see kind of starting to happen behind the scenes with these kind of standards.
That's a really good point. I noticed that when I was looking through the industry guidelines, because there's a big section under insurers about how they can help drive social change and by shifting behaviors. And I'm thinking, wait a second, that's not the job of an insurance company. The insurance company is there to provide insurance, not drive behavioral change. And I found that paragraph very challenging or problematic, I guess. Is there any indication that this will be phased in Canada? Because it seems to me that these are incredibly complex, that there isn't enough, accountants and auditors or whatever in order to help companies do this. So is there any sense that we're going to follow sort of what the Europeans are doing? The Europeans are phasing their standards in over, I think, 4 or 5 years. And it starts with the biggest corporations first, and then incrementally expands until it affects every company, no matter how big it is, including small, medium enterprises. So have you heard anything? Have you gotten any sense that this could be phased in Canada as well, or what's happening?
I have not. Now, I have not heard or seen anything from the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board or any of the regulators like the Alberta regulator, which would impact my company, which is Alberta based. Now, before I go on, I will say I am very pleased that we do have representation on the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board from two people who work in oil and gas companies and are Calgary-based companies. So I'm very thankful that we do have some representation there. Now, that being said, it is quite unclear to me what exactly we're going to be required to report here in Canada. In my opinion, I find that our federal government in particular is rather unrealistic about timelines when it comes to anything related to climate. So I'm not super optimistic that we will get a lot of leeway for the reporting timelines. I mean, I think in part, there is such a support from the Canadian federal government. A number of our professional agencies in Canada have voiced a lot of support. As you said, the ISSB has their mini office here in Montreal that Canada lobbied quite hard for. So I suspect with that comes sort of a promise that they're going to implement it, and they're going to implement it quite quickly. Yeah. And then the other thing, you have the Canada Pension Plan, and 11 of Canada's sort of larger, more prominent regional pension plans, such as AIMCO, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, et cetera, they've all expressed support for this. They want it now. In fact, they want it yesterday. So I don't know what we're going to see. I'm hopeful that they're going to give small businesses some reprieve at least, because this is going to be very, very difficult for them. And even if you're a private company, you're not going to be immune from this, because you're going to have to report to your customers. You're part of someone's supply chain. So you're going to have to tell us what it is that your emissions are. There's the Modern Slavery Act just got implemented here in Canada. So you have to prove that you're not using child or forced labor. So again, if you're a small company, how are you doing that? You have to talk to your larger oil and gas companies who are your customers. So you're not getting away from any of this. But what I will also say, though, is these claims of increased investor focus on all of this is not totally accurate from what I'm hearing. Investors don't seem to care as much as we're sort of hearing from these standard setters. They're really concerned about returns. So the consequence of non-compliance with all of this is just really not clear to me. Does this mean like we're not going to get insurance? There's going to be no investment. They're going to close our bank account? It's not clear, because I don't think, again, we're getting the honesty that we need. Who's actually using this? Is it important if we're driving forward and we have to report all of this in 2025? Who's using it?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is what I've heard all the time. Investors want it. Investors are pushing. Well, which investors? Is it the CPPs of the world? Is it the BlackRocks of the world? Is it the Vanguards of the world? And how come they get precedence over everybody else who maybe are more concerned about what their returns are rather than ticking whatever boxes for sustainability and climate? I think you've made an excellent point with that. I wanted to just kind of go back a little bit, because you mentioned biodiversity and social justice and whatnot. These are the first two of a planned larger set. And I know that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is supposed to have their new standard ready by COP28 in November. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the ISSB has their consultation open about where they should go next. And so one of the things on the list is biodiversity and some of these other social justice things. And so if people want to comment on what the ISSB ought to do next, they can do so at the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board website, and they can that's the open consultation right now, is that, you can say what you want next. And I'm thinking, really, can we just stop here for now and see how this works before we add on another layer? And then your point about urgency, I heard that so much. You're right. When I listened to the different webinars and all their meetings and whatnot, it was urgency, urgency, urgency. And I feel like with the war in Ukraine, people are starting to wake up that maybe we need oil and gas. Maybe we're more energy secure. We have better national security, especially in Canada, if we're able to use our own oil and natural gas rather than be dependent on outside sources. For example, the solar panels and wind turbines, most of those materials aren't produced in Canada. They're produced or refined in China. And so then it makes us dependent on another nation, which, as we saw with Europe and Ukraine, that's a problem if you're dependent on another country. So I think people are waking up to it. And there was a sense that they really had to push this thing quicker than maybe they ought to, just in terms of trying to find what's the most refined and best way to do this. But it seems that this was rushed through very quickly, especially when you get someone like Mark Carney saying this kind of thing normally takes 7 years. It took them 7 years to work out the TCFD things, and but the ISSB is going at lightning speed to bring this in so quick. And I thought, well, why? Why does it have to be so quick? But as you point out, it's this narrative or idea that Earth's going to explode on fire or something if we don't reduce emissions within the next however many years they've put forward. And one last point I just wanted to mention is that in the climate, the IFRS S2 climate related financial disclosures, emissions is mentioned 199 times, which tells you what their focus and emphasis is. It's on emissions and reducing emissions, but mostly from fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And within what they call the basis for conclusions, which sort of explains why it is that they made certain choices based on the feedback that they received, within one of those paragraphs, they do talk about climate-related developments can include macroeconomic factors. For example, regulatory limits on the use of particular fossil fuels. So again, there's sort of this normalizing of like, hey, we've just got to get rid of fossil fuels. Like it's not negotiable. We've got to get rid of them. And so yes, emissions are really the biggest concern that they have. I mean, for us in oil field services, under the industry specific guidance, water is also another consideration. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Within the sort of the base standards, it really is completely related to emissions. What's your strategy for getting rid of them? Climate change is only going to provide negatives or result in really bad things happening. There's really just nothing positive that can come from continuing to use fossil fuels. So what is it that you're going to do? Are you going to have to change your business model? I mean, they actually say that, like, you're going to have to look at what is your business model and how is that going to have to adjust to this new low emissions world. So I think you're absolutely right. Emissions, high emissions, bad. Fossil fuels, bad.
Yeah. It's putting it into that sort of black and white, just setting it up as being the evil villain. And meanwhile, we have the hero being renewables or whatever, which, is not compatible with a modern technological society, unfortunately, at least at the level of technology that we have. I haven't had an opportunity to take a look at what they have put forward with respect to nuclear power, but perhaps it will be a little bit better than what they put forward for oil and gas in the standards. One of the things you touched on was the supply chains. And it's not just the supply chains. I think that people are going to have to be reporting on whatnot. It's that banks are going to be requiring this of all of their customers. Now, it may be that banks phase this in, the way Europe is doing. And so maybe they'll only require this information more specifically from larger companies. But banks have made commitments to reduce the amount of gross emissions on their books. And so it becomes a matter of, they need to cut a few and which companies are they going to target in order to make their emissions balance look better in terms of their transition plans? Because I think what people need to understand is that in these transition plans, it's a reduction, and you have to meet your reduction targets. And those reductions must continue until you're net zero at some point in the future. So it's not like, okay, we're doing really well at this particular pace, at this level this year and for the next couple of years. No. Every year it has to be lower. So, for some things, if you're already a really efficient user of water, for example, and there's not much more that you can reduce, what happens when they're saying the standards or your bank or whatever is saying, I'm sorry, but your progress on reducing water isn't good enough, even though maybe that's the maximum you could do. But with your transition plan, it has to be lower and lower and lower.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought this up because, I'm a bit of a contrarian, which I'm sure your audience is picking up on. But I'm also a little bit of a rabble rouser at times, and so as I've been out at different events, with people that represent the investment community, one of the things that I kind of challenge them on is this whole emissions reduction piece of it. So Canada's 6 largest banks all have some sort of emissions reduction plan for or requirement for their energy portfolios. And they're typically sort of around a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030. And so my question to people is, well, what if we can't meet that? Like, what if we've done everything we can and we just can't meet it? What is the consequence? Are you going to stop lending us money? Are you going to make it such that the interest rates are so high that we have to go find another institution to borrow from? And consistently, I get a very sort of circular answer. They kind of walk me around. It's all very vague. And the only thing that I can conclude is they have not actually thought about the consequences. Like their answer is generally, well, you're just going to have to. And so then I press them and I say, but what if we can't? What are you going to do to us? And nobody has an answer. And so the other conclusion I draw is these numbers are completely arbitrary. This 30% reduction by 2030.
Yeah.
There's no science behind it. They have no idea if it's achievable or if it's reasonable or if it's going to be economic. I mean, it just goes to show that everybody's sort of jumping on a bandwagon and saying, okay, well, yeah, somebody else said 30% by 2030, so we should also say that. And this whole space is just moving at a pace and at a level where we are not being reasonable as to whether we can actually achieve what it is that they want by the time that they want. And that includes reporting all of this information in the time frame that they want.
Right. And it's that you have to report this every year, all the time, keeping track. Now, the argument I've heard is that, sure, it'll be difficult the first couple years to put this together, but once you have it going, it'll be easy. So with that in mind, how expensive is software? I mean, do companies have to invest in software to keep track of all this, to say, okay, I've got this supplier and they're giving me these numbers, and so I'm putting that into my little database and for my reporting? I mean, is that the route that you have to go?
Well, that's actually a great question, and it's something that comes up for me every few months because of my company, because I'm the only one that kind of does this. I do not have a sort of a solution put forward for a data repository. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this information has to go somewhere. It has to be accessible to a variety of people within the company. It has to be accessible to auditors, et cetera. It has to have a certain level of sort of internal audit security, meaning, you can't manipulate the data and, not everybody can access it to change it. So in some way, yeah, we have to come up with some sort of database. And believe me, I get phone calls and emails almost every day from somebody trying to sell me software or some sort of magical solution to all of this that's going to make my life so easy. I'm yet to find one that's going to be a push of a button. It's going to get it all done. But believe me, they have solutions and they have dollar figures. And we're hearing anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000 plus a year in licensing for basic software. So again, This is where I go back to what do small companies do? They're going to have to track their emissions and even their own supply chains, et cetera. So what is it that they're going to do, and how are they going to put it into a format that can then get it to my company in a way that I can then use the information? So yeah, absolutely. I think the software piece of it is it will be inevitable, and it will be costly. So I don't have a solution yet because I don't know what. I don't know what the most cost-effective approach is. And I think this sort of ties back in general. I'll kind of make this statement. How do companies implement this ESG reporting in a cost-effective way to mitigate risks while not overly burdening our resources? And I just don't know what exactly the right answer is, because it's not just the dollar cost of licensing software. It's everything that goes around it. It's all the people resources needed to put the information in and then report it out in a way that mitigates our liabilities.
Speaking of liability, I notice in the standard that they want the specific individual who will be responsible for advising the company or the board or whatever on these issues. They want an individual. So are you concerned for personal liability since you're the sort of ESG manager for your company? Are you concerned that if something goes wrong, that you would be personally held liable?
I haven't actually really thought about that. Like, it hasn't sort of twigged that I would have a personal level of responsibility, because I still see that a lot of it, the ESG oversight rests with the board and the executive. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they really do ultimately want to know who's responsible sort of on the operational side of things, on the practitioner side of who's managing all of this. Yeah, I guess I have to hope that there's going to be some sort of protection for individuals. I mean, I think that if we start to get into a place where people can start to be sued, individuals can start to be sued because they put the wrong number out there, it's going to create ripple effects. So I have to be somewhat optimistic that the courts or legislators, whatever, are going to set some boundaries around that liability and limit that liability. But I think you're absolutely right. It's not obvious in these standards. What are the consequences? It's not clear.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is what bothers me about the speed at which this is implemented, because there seems to be a lot of questions that aren't being answered or addressed appropriately. And you mentioned that in the basis for conclusions, they mentioned the feedback received. Well, I read the summaries of their feedback, and anything that was remotely critical was just kind of dismissed as, oh, well, we have all these other groups and investors and whatnot, stakeholders who are far more supportive. So we're just going to listen to them. And what I found they did afterwards is they did targeted consultations, targeted feedback. So it then diluted all the criticism that they received about, maybe you're going too fast. What about this? What about that? There's certain issues with the data requirements you're asking for, the use of the World Resources Institute Aqueduct program, which is appalling, actually, that this could even be used as the baseline for water risk, because it doesn't take into account any of the sort of local data that provinces and regions and territories are responsible for. And it's old, it's outdated. So I don't know, that bothers me. But in any event, what was concerning was that they went around, did this targeted stakeholder consultation feedback, and used it as a sort of means to dilute the critical feedback they received. Because as going through the documents and comparing the draft to what was finalized, there's not much difference, but there's subtle differences that actually make it worse. And they didn't address really any of the criticisms that were made, except to provide relief for a year. Give me a break.
Yeah.
So
Scope 3 emissions relief for a year is
for a year.
Nothing.
Yeah, really. And it seems really vague in how are companies supposed to provide this information? There's all these guidelines and whatnot. Is there a form? Is there just a narrative that you write? They keep saying it's about telling your story. I don't see how. It makes no sense. But it goes back to the whole idea that they're just rushing this forward without having really thought through the consequences and then looking forward to adding more before this is even really sorted things out. And then the other issue I wanted to ask you was about security of the data that you're providing, because in a couple of the webinars that I've been watching and whatnot, they've talked about all of this information and how it will go towards the net zero data public utility, which is this massive global database that will be curated and hosted at the UN. It's a project of Emmanuel Macron and Michael Bloomberg. And all of this data will be put into one central repository that will be free for companies and individuals and civil society to access as they see fit. And I thought, well, what about proprietary information? What about data that shouldn't just be out there? But all of this apparently is going to go to this net zero data public utility.
I think that you bring up something that's really important, is like, how much information should be out there, who should have access to it, and again, what are the boundaries around liability and particularly litigation liabilities. We can't live in a world where you have a small number of sinister NGOs that are sort of suing every company they don't like into existence. And I think, if you think right now they're just going after oil and gas companies and you're not an oil and gas company, so I think that's a bit naive, because they're going to start going after everyone. So I think you're right. There's probably going to have to be a bit of a reckoning in terms of what companies are going to be willing to put out there. And I don't sort of see enough discussion about this by these international standard setters, or even the framework setters like, the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, or the CDP, which was formerly the Climate Disclosure Project, or, World Economic Forum also has its own sort of framework-ish type thing that they have. And there really isn't sort of a discussion around, should we do this? How should we do this? And how do we limit and protect individuals and businesses? So I'm not quite sure where this is going to go. I hope that if the standard setters are not going to be reasonable, that we're going to see businesses push back a little bit.
Have you heard any are you getting any information or feedback that this is even coming? Like, if you hadn't been out there looking at this or hearing me talk about it or whatever, was there any outreach to your company that, these standards are coming, maybe you should get ready, any of that?
No, and I think you're right. Like, I don't know how companies that don't have somebody dedicated to this even know, or if you're not sort of following this space. I mean, because of the energy advocacy that I do, I'm aware of all kinds of sort of policies coming up in Canada, or different requirements, or even sort of like, where's the mindset? Where might they go with this? So I at least have a little bit of a basis to start to follow, to start to pay attention. So I don't know what companies are doing that don't have somebody who has some responsibility for this. Now, in talking to a lot of customers, et cetera, a lot of sort of the smaller to mid-sized companies have somebody that does this off the side of their desk. So, they're a production engineer and they get to do ESG or things like that. And so I don't know how much time they have to dedicate to go and search. Now, I think obviously people who have a work responsibility probably end up signing up for different notifications, et cetera, and you sort of start to learn more information. But without that, I'm not exactly sure how they're finding out, because I have never been reached out to by the Alberta Securities Administrators or anything. It just sort of ends up, a lot of times somebody sends me something and I'm like, oh, okay, hey, I have to pay attention to that or whatever. And so it really is a bit of a collective effort within the company, but it's a hodgepodge, and I don't know, it's a bit of a challenge. And so, when I hear things from you, like about these public disclosures, I go, oh my God, okay, well, here's another thing I have to look into, because again, that wasn't a press release that we got. It's just randomly listening to thought leaders like yourself who are really in depth paying attention to this.
Yeah, that's a good point about paying attention, because, businesses are busy, and they're busy trying to produce a product or a service that people need and desire. And their day is full. And if I could just comment, I think it was last year at the World Economic Forum, I think back in 2022. And there was the head of Unilever, or one of the senior people at Unilever, who was saying they have an entire department working on sustainability, spending thousands of hours, tens of thousands, probably more money to do this. And even they are having trouble putting it all together. Now, if an enormous corporation like Unilever with dedicated people are having problems doing just basic kind of emissions accounting and scenario analysis and all that, what does that mean for, smaller companies or just smaller businesses? And what's concerning is that this is a whole economy transformation to monitor and report on this kind of data. And there's been no conversation. And that's concerning.
It is. And maybe that's by design a little bit. Like, let's sort of slip this in. There's going to be companies that are just simply not going to be able to manage this effectively. And so then what happens to them? Do they lose their bank accounts? Do they lose investment? Does that then mean they end up going bankrupt and a larger company buys them for pennies on the dollar?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. And, I don't want to sound sort of pessimistic about it, but it does have me very concerned about what happens with smaller companies, because if we wipe out our small businesses, that's no good for anybody. It takes away competition. It takes away choice for consumers. And I think that we all benefit from really strong small businesses in our communities. They are really the fabric that ties us all together. To walk down the street to your little store, to know who owns and runs it, to be able to talk to them. If they get wiped out by a big multinational, that's not good for any of us. They're the ones that dedicate resources, time, give money, etc., to Little League, and they're the ones that keep our communities going. Multinationals may cut a check, but they're not there in your community the same way that our small businesses are. And so I think, again, this is why it's imperative that we are all paying attention to what is going on here. It's not enough to just say you're going to fight this and you're not going to report on it, because it's just not going to be that easy.
Yeah. Oh, so I want to conclude with just one thing, and that is what I've heard is that the responsibility has been sort of abrogated to the standard setters because they're independent bodies. And I think this is a really good excuse for elected representatives to say, hey, it's not us. We're not doing it. It's these independent standard setters. And these are just the standards, and these regulators have made it so. And I'm thinking I would rather have an elected person at least acknowledge some kind of responsibility, so the public could at least say, no, we don't agree with that. We don't want to do it. But to just kind of put it into the hands of regulators who are supposedly independent. But what does independent mean? They're selected amongst peers. Okay. But that isn't, why are they given that much control over our economy? Because that's basically what will be happening.
I think you make a really good point. And again, this is why people really do have to pay attention to what's going on. I mean, not everything is bad about sort of this ESG disclosure world, and I don't want to give that representation that the sky is falling in this regard, but we do have to be honest about some of the shortcomings. Well thought out criticism, I think, is warranted.
Well, I think we're running up to the end of the time here. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me for so long. I wanted this to be a bit shorter, but the conversation was going so well, I couldn't stop. So thank you so much, Deidra. Thank you. And I hope you have a lovely weekend.
You as well. I really enjoyed this. And yes, I wanted to keep it short too, because in some ways it's kind of, almost boring financial talk, but in other ways it's such a fascinating topic. So thank you so much. And I hope your listeners enjoy this conversation.
I hope so too. Thank you.